It gives me a great pleasure today to deliver this, I call it a public lecture, in terms of giving us a helicopter view in looking at what are the regulatory policies that are being implemented to try to deal with the novel nicotine and tobacco products globally. So my presentation is going to be basically touching on 5 points. One, just looking at the basic taxation framework that countries are implementing. And I want to highlight 2 case studies about policy mismatch, which will basically highlight some of the speakers that have already given us indication that we do need to harmonize our policies, because having one country implementing one policy while other countries are not aligned with that may undermine our taxation framework. And point number 3, I would like to talk about the socioeconomic inequalities of taxation, which is something that I know within economic space, that part of evidence is becoming more and more clear, that while we know that taxation can improve, can avert consumption outcomes, but there are some inequalities because population groups are not responding similar to taxation. So I will highlight some of those, and then we can deliberate what we need to do to address the populations that are left behind. And the 4th point that I would like to cover is to talk about illicit, which is become now a brainchild of developing countries, because the high-income countries have done at least decent amount of work to try to mop up illicit trade. We in developing world were still struggling to get this in order, and because of that, our policies are most likely to be undermined by illicit products. And lastly, I will cover the new generation tobacco products, looking at what has been done, where we are so far, what is the taxation framework, and where is Kenya when it coming to the new generation products. I'm sure a lot of people have seen this. I've presented in a number of forums. In basic economics, how do you control for consumption of tobacco? The first step, you always have to understand what is the affordability of the product, because the affordability is the one that tells you the likelihood of consumption to persist, and then you need to implement your taxation policies so that you're able to control your consumption. The second step that is so important is then to start tracking the volume. Is the volume increasing year on year? And if the volume is increasing, you know that the public health is most likely to be violated because the population is consuming the product. The third step, usually economists are very much committed into excise as a mechanism to increase the tax and make the products more expensive, because we know the elasticity of demand. It tells us that then the consumption must go down. So this is the instrument that government they've always been using to try to cap consumption. It's been working very well in many, many geographies, including in developing countries. It is still by far a perfect instrument to stop consumption by just increasing the tax. However, I must qualify this. You do need other policies to support your taxation regime, because there are cases where even if you're progressive and bullish in your taxation, but the industry can be able to undermine those efforts. The 4th part, once you increase your tax, like I said, you expect the price to be high, and once the price is high, people are not going to be able to afford it, and then consumption will then decline. So that's a basic framework. It doesn't matter where you are. You're in the US, all economies are obsessed about this. And this is the relationship that we are always expecting to see in any geography. So, but there are problems. And I would like to draw your attention with what is happening in South Africa. I think some people can pick with my accent. I'm born and raised there. There's an interesting case in South Africa if you look at what's happening in South Africa and Zimbabwe and Mozambique. South Africa has an aggressive taxation policy. They are bullish. I mean, within the space of 3 years, South Africa has doubled its taxation for tobacco products. But then the neighboring countries, which is Zimbabwe and Mozambique, they are not as bullish as South Africa. In fact, I will dare argue that their taxation was receding. So what you then tend to see is that if you look at the average price in South Africa for a 20-pack cigarette, oh my goodness. Sorry. Oh, yeah. Yes. If you look at the average price of the 20-pack cigarette in South Africa now, it's about $3.42. If you look at Zimbabwe, it's $1.16. It's because South Africa, with all this bullish taxation, to some degree the industry has been pushing, the tax to the consumer. That's why the prices are high. But here's an interesting phenomenon when you look at the duty-free tax, which is the amount of tobacco you can bring from Zimbabwe into South Africa. The current law says you're allowed to bring 200 cigarettes per person. So meaning if I'm in Zimbabwe, I have 200 cigarette stick, I can come to the border, it's legal. I come into the country. So the number of Zimbabweans that cross that border to come to South Africa is about 2,500 daily. If we do the maths there, it means there's a potential that there can be 500,000 sticks that can cross from Zimbabwe to South Africa legally. Because the policy is not set correctly. There's misalignment between the two countries. One is taxing bullish, but the other guys are not doing that. Then you have a huge price difference. And because of that, we know that the neighboring countries to some degree do undermine the taxation effort that the other countries implementing, which then re-emphasize the point that we do need to have some consolidation here. The same story with Mozambique. Like I said, South Africa, average price is $3.42. Mozambique, just less than $1. So it's cheapest to smoke in Mozambique. And here's the interesting thing, there's 2,800 Mozambicans that cross that border coming to South Africa daily. And we've got a policy that says you can bring about 200 sticks to come to the country. This roughly translates that there's about 560,000, potentially, cigarettes that can move from Mozambique to come to South Africa legally, because the law allows that. So one of the biggest push in my advice to the South African government is that that needs to be reformed, because it will severely undermine the tobacco control activities that the country is trying to achieve. In fact, that's the reason why South Africa has the highest illicit now into the continent. It's mainly because it comes from the borders. Because the law are not set correctly, then it begins to violate all the efforts that the government has been trying to achieve. I think there's valuable lessons here, especially for Kenya, because we also have our neighbors, and some of the time the borders are not working correctly. There's a potential for this case to also be witnessed here. So what are the socioeconomic inequalities associated with taxation? We spend a lot of time arguing in many, many forums about some of the population groups that are not responding from taxation. In fact, from most discussion even in WHO now, there's an admission that if you tax higher, it usually bites on women, not on men, especially in the African context. There's a study that was done in 2019 that shows that. And all of this is pure economics. Africa still remains by far a patriarchal society. Men have the money. So if you have the money, you can be able to withstand that tax shock. Then they can still buy tobacco. But most women don't have the money. If you increase taxation, it tends to benefit the women more. So because we are in this room, there's a need to think what we're going to do with the population groups that are left behind. If you look at from international space, a 10% increase in tax in high-income countries and in low-income countries give us different consumption declines. In high-income countries, it usually results into about 4% decline in tobacco consumption. But the current evidence is that here, because the income is still a bit lower, we are in a better position to even get better outcome. The World Bank is projecting that with a 10% increase, you'll be able to get about 6% average fall into the demand, which means we are in the perfect space. If we just bullish enough, we can be able to reduce the consumption more aggressively. If you look into the youth population group, if you increase your tax, most evidence, in fact, the study was done here in Tanzania, they show that the youth are more responsive to tax increase compared to the older people. And again, it's basic economics. They don't have the money. That's why it bites them. So these are the things that we need to always think when we always need to be mindful when we're taxing, that in most cases, it does not really have these homogeneous outcomes that we intend. I love the presentation that we have yesterday. When you look at the quit ratio globally, one of the best studies that has ever been produced, in my view, to look at when do people aggressively want to stop quitting consumption of tobacco products. The average age now is between 45 and 59. The danger in a country like ours here in Kenya is that more and more youngsters start smoking early. meaning that they will be able to smoke at least for about 20 years before they start putting much effort to want to stop. And that's very late. And I love you, Dr. Toro, with the idea of putting cessation clinic. I do believe that this is the cohort that needs to be targeted so that you prevent a situation where people want to stop smoking while they're already on their dying bed. Because we know, epidemiologically speaking, for a smoker, it will take roughly in Africa 15 to 17 years to develop cancer. But the brain health outcomes are the ones that get eroded instantly. So we do need to prevent this situation so that we want to see people quitting a bit earlier. This was a global study. That's the average that they've got. When I was running the numbers yesterday, I think in Kenya, I'm getting an average of about 47, which is pretty much aligning with most of the African countries. And that's a picture we need to change. In terms of socioeconomic status and how it influences behavior once your tax a bit higher, it's a very interesting study. It's published in 2023. It shows that theoretically, we expect that the poor should be the people who are more responsive to taxation increase. But the evidence was not significant. And that became a very glaring picture for anyone who studied these issues more correctly, because we were expecting that if you're taxing a bit high, because the poor do not have the money, are the ones that are most likely to benefit from the taxation, but it seems as if things are not working that way. And my hypothesis here is that it's because developing countries have been filtrated by illicit tobacco. Even if you're taxing aggressively, because the existence of illicit tobacco on the ground, which in most of the cases is cheaper, that's why you're not getting your intended outcome. So currently, going to 2050, the current forecast is that all African countries that are more aggressive in taxations will be able to improve tobacco or smoking-related debts. And that's South Africa, DRC, Madagascar, and Ethiopia. Those remains the classical example of what we need to do in terms of aligning our policies going to the future. So this is not me, these are just all the references that back my perspective here. I've been speaking about illicit, which is a big problem now of developing countries. And so what's happening there? European Union commissioned a study to try to develop what I call the stylized facts of illicit consumption. They came up with a very beautiful paper in 2021 where they saw that if you have a country with high inequality, if you've got a country with high population density, if you've got a country that is closer to a neighbor that's got porous border, the likelihood of your illicits to be high will be there. And I think we fit exactly those pictures. And one of the first thing that I've been discussing with a lot of scholars when I came here was we need to do a tax gap analysis in Kenya, independent of what the industry is telling us. It has never been done. Because every time you try to speak illicit, it's usually industry give you their figures. And the experience that we have is that they always not telling the truth. So we do need to get independent tax gap analysis to try to estimate how is the illicit dynamics in the country and in the continent at large, because we still don't see a lot of countries doing that type of work. If you look at individuals who consume illicit, what is the profile? It's mostly the youth, the people who don't have much resources, and those who are on the lower segment of the population group, because illicit in developing countries, it's still easy to pick by just looking at the price difference. Unlike in Europe, where it's more complicated, because it's still a very branded product, but just smuggled it from the borders. So price does not give you a clear indication. But in our geographies, illicit is still by far associated with just price. The lower the price, the easier the people consume it. And that's why the paper from 2023 that shows that even though when you're taxing high, the lower segment of the population were not responsive to it. My hypothesis is that it's because of the filtration of the illicit on the ground. We do also know that, like in South Africa, Connie has published a paper in 2020 shows that the unemployed are more likely to use illicit compared to those who can afford. Those who afford, they're still loyal into their branded products. So this is the picture that ultimately, while we talk about taxation, we still need to find innovative ways of how to mop up illicit. Because if we don't do that, it's most likely going to undermine the taxation policy. So where we are when it comes to the new generation tobacco and nicotine products, this is the equalizer, in my view, because the rest of the world also is battling with this concept. It's something that's still new. The policy framework is still new. The taxation regime, there's no agreement now. What is the best tax system to deal with the new generation product? Everyone is still obsessed by dispelling the industry myth, because the industry is ahead of us. They've produced their own pseudoscience about the product. They call them risk-free and all of that. So if you look at Europe, including the US, most of the scholars are still doing clinical trials to look at the truth behind the narrative that has been perpetuated. But happily, publications are beginning to come in. We see studies basically that begins to contradict what the industry has been telling us. If you look, for example, in Lebanon, the industry is always arguing that Juul does not have the highest concentration of nicotine. If you puff it, it has less risk. But there are studies published by good journals that contradicts that the amount of nicotine in Juul is really, really high. And some studies we've done in rats to look at the exposure to smoke coming from traditional cigarette versus the electronic cigarette to see if there's any differences in terms of lung injury, and there's none. Meaning that the damage that the product does is pretty much similar towards the tobacco product, the traditional tobacco. If you look into, the studies come from Poland, they show that the people who are using, especially the vapes, they are highly addictive because of the concentration of nicotine, which in most cases is not declared correctly. So you consume the vapes, the first thing that happens is addiction. And there's something that I was thinking about it yesterday, and when I'm looking at the taxation framework, there is no framework to look at concentration of nicotine, and the industry now is putting alkaline salt on top of the nicotine. And we know clinically, once you put alkaline salt in nicotine, it increases the speed of nicotine and how it's going to move into your brain. Because traditionally, if you take nicotine, you will develop addiction, but it's a bit slower. You put the alkaline salt, it accelerates, it hits the hypothalamus of the brain quicker, and the addictions level comes more instantly. So the taxation regime needs to understand the products more thoroughly, and then we can be able to propose what should be the progressive tax that's speaking to what the industry has done, so that we're able to correct that. So, so far, like I said, when you see World Bank in 2019, shows that there are about 7,700 products that are coming from this segment. I know Kenya Revenue Authority might not like this. It's a nightmare to try to regulate this amount of flavors. So then from the taxation space, you need to think more innovatively in terms of how do you deal with so much volume, because I think this is done deliberately. They're trying to flood the markets with all these flavors. So from the taxation point of view, you're going to be drowned trying to create taxation for so many products. So that's why it's not so far when you see internationally, there's no constant voice in terms of what is the best tax regime to deal with this, because we're still trying to figure it out. So in terms of studies that come from the US, we see that those who are using the vapes are 6 times more likely to start smoking traditional cigarette, especially in the space of 6 to 1 year. So that then basically contradicts what the industry has been saying, that this is risk-free. It's a gateway product to hook people and get them addicted to nicotine. Then they have to migrate and start smoking traditional cigarettes. These are the global taxation regime that are existing. Kenya is part of the countries that has opted to regulate, because currently the school of thought is 2. There are countries that go for universal ban. And there's countries that says, no, let's regulate and impose taxation and use the taxation arm to stop consumption. In Africa, I think it's, I think Madagascar was thinking about putting a ban, but also Mauritius, they've put a ban. Those countries' ban tend to work best, simply because they're a small island. Everything that comes from the county, it has to come from the sea. We put a lot of personnel to deal with whatever is coming in. It becomes difficult if you've got neighbors, if you're sharing border. Bans do not work much effective because it can always come from the neighbor, and the borders in Africa are porous. That's why the ban story, in my view, it tends to work best, especially in countries that are more isolated. But like I said, I don't have the perfect story when it comes to how to deal with this. I'm still trying to review it to see which countries are most likely to get the consumption declining more aggressively of the new generation product based on the taxation arm. I'm following Israel quite closely because they've imposed a very aggressive taxation. You can see the percentage of tax that they're putting, especially in Israel. It's as high as like 120% of the price. So we expect that the consumption there will decline. We're still waiting for data. I'm still trying to analyze that. But in time, we do need to think about these things because it's got huge implication in terms of the public health. Ultimately, WHO, this responsibility lies with them. They need to communicate and tell the world which is the best tax regime to assist you in stopping the new generation product. I'm still remaining active to assist in that space. In terms of where we are with this product, they're still consumed by high-income countries because they're relatively expensive. US, Europe, they're by far biggest consumer. The market share comes from China because of the population, US, Europe also. Africa, we've just done an optimization study. I think the prevalence is sitting at about 9%. Kenya, our own study shows that about 5.2%. So it's not something we should celebrate that our prevalence is a bit lower. It simply means that the industry is beginning to penetrate. But in Europe and in the US, they've started their vandalism long ago. That's why most of the government, they are putting a lot of ban. I know a number of states in the US, they've banned a lot of this product. I think China has also put a ban. So we also have to get into that space to see what is that we need to do to protect our population. This is just the last summary of the story in terms of Kenya. I've talked a lot about this in terms of our taxation. It's a bit regressive. If you look at 2020, in 2023, when we remove the inflation adjustment, the tax basically regressed a lot. It's not around 42%. It's about 32% now because you've removed the inflation adjustment. So we've taken a wrong direction by not adjusting the tax component with inflation. We need to correct that. And WHO has always prescribed that our tax needs to be bullish. We need to tax between 70 and 75%. There's a scope to do that. In terms of the vapes, again, we're not taxing progressively there, simply because of the way the products are, well, we're still not imposing excise, let me put like that, on the vapes. And what we need to do, we need to start imposing that. And the small tax that is imposed there is just minuscule to stop the consumption. We need to revise that, and I'm happy, Dr. Toro, you hear from the next report that's come, these things need to be reflected. With oral nicotine pouch, the same. The tax is just too low to make meaningful contribution. Ultimately, we do need to scale a bit high. And I've been hearing a lot of discussion with some of the colleagues here saying that, but no, you can't be too bullish when it's coming to taxation. And I beg to differ when it coming to that. South Africa, in a space of 3 years, like I said, it increased its taxes by 100%. The industry didn't run away. It is possible to do that. You just need to get the proper political will. You will get it right. I think, yeah, these are my key takeouts. Tobacco taxation, it does have some inequality dynamics that we need to have. And point number 2, we need to monitor industry, how it responds from taxation increase, because there's so many tricks that they are employing. Unfortunately, in Africa, there's only one center that looks into that, the tobacco industry monitoring. It's based at University of Pretoria. I think we do need pockets of excellence in each and every country so that we're able to do a better job here. Illicit is still a problem. Like I said, the World Bank shows that it's more dominant in our region and it's got a potential to undermine our taxation effort. The taxation systems, like I said, we've removed inflation adjustment. We need to correct that. We have the two-tier tax systems. We need to correct that. We need to have a uniform tax systems because that's the best standard. And then the continent definitely needs to have a more uniform tax systems, whether it's coming to price, when it's coming to taxation, because that's the only way you can be able to effectively address that. European Union is doing a better job because they look at tobacco control as a regional body, not as an individual state. Of course, there's still some differences, but because they are so integrated, they are winning. That's why I'm saying a taxation mismatch in the sister countries can potentially undermine all the efforts that you're doing. Thank you very much.